Odessa Blanchard paid $3 for 45 acres at a county tax auction, a sum so small that the auctioneer read it aloud twice, as though he expected someone to correct him. Nobody bid against her. The parcel had been abandoned for the better part of 2 decades, and in that time, Kudzu had done what Kudzu does in that part of the state, which was swallow the land whole. Vines draped over everything taller than a fence post, entire sections of the property reduced to soft green mounds that could have been hiding a barn, a car, or nothing at all, and nobody left alive who remembered which. "You bought $3 worth of kudzu," said her cousin Walter Lee Aldrich, who ran cattle on the adjoining section and had watched the parcel sit derelict for as long as he could remember. "That's not a farm, Odessa. That's a science experiment nobody wants to fund." "It's 45 acres, Odessa said. "The kudzu's just sitting on top of it. Kudzu doesn't just sit. Kudzu digs in. You'll spend the next 10 years fighting it and you still won't win." She didn't disagree with the difficulty of it, exactly. She'd grown up 2 counties over, close enough to know what a kudzu-choked hillside actually took to clear by hand or machine, and she had neither the money for the machine nor, at 58 years old, quite the stamina left for clearing 45 acres by hand. What she had instead, from a smaller piece of land she'd kept for years before this purchase, was a herd of 31 goats that had, over time, developed a reputation among her neighbors as escape artists, fence testers, and relentless eaters of anything green that dared grow within reach of their pen. Goats eat kudzu. Everyone in that part of the country knew as much, in the vague way people know something is generally true without having tested it themselves at any real scale. What Odessa had also read, in an old agricultural extension bulletin about kudzu reclamation, was that goats didn't just clear kudzu vine by vine from the top down, the way a person with a machete might. Given enough time and enough hunger, they worked their way down through a kudzu mat to whatever structure lay underneath, browsing lower and lower as they exhausted the easy leaves above, eventually exposing whatever the vine had spent 20 years quietly burying. "You're turning goats loose on 45 acres and just seeing what happens," Walter Lee said, watching her unload the herd that first spring, portable electric fencing rolled up in the truck bed beside them. "That's not a plan. That's an experiment with livestock." "It's both," Odessa said, and started fencing off the first section. She worked the goats in rotating paddocks, a few acres at a time, moving the portable fencing every week or 2, as each section got browsed down close enough that she judged it was time to move the herd onward and let the cleared ground start to recover. It was slow work by design. She wasn't trying to eliminate the kudzu in a single pass, which she knew from her reading was nearly impossible without repeated seasons of grazing pressure, but simply to open the canopy enough, section by section, to see what she was actually dealing with underneath all that green. The goats worked through the first several acres exactly as expected, stripping vine and leaf down to bare, tangled root crowns, and leaving behind churned, browsed ground that looked considerably less mysterious than the unbroken kudzu blanket had. It was in the herd's 3rd paddock, roughly 6 weeks into the project, that Odessa's hired hand, a wiry, practical young man named Desmond Ochoa, called her out to the fence line with a tone in his voice that made her drop what she was doing. "There's wood under here," he said, standing over a section the goats had cleared down to root crowns and bare dirt. "Old wood, look." What the goats had exposed, working their way down through decades of vine growth, was the unmistakable shape of an old orchard row, the rotted but still recognizable remains of pruned fruit tree trunks, spaced with the deliberate regularity no wild growth would ever produce, running in a line that continued, once Odessa and Desmond followed it by eye, through the still-standing kudzu ahead, for what looked like the better part of an acre. Odessa spent the rest of that week doing what she probably should have done before ever bidding $3 on the parcel, digging through county records, and eventually finding an elderly former resident, a man named Chalmers Fegan, who'd grown up 2 farms over and remembered, from his own childhood 70 years before, that the property had once belonged to a family who'd kept a modest but well-regarded orchard, apples mostly, with a scattering of pear and fig trees along the property's southern edge, before the family sold off and moved on sometime in the 1970s, and the land passed through a string of absentee owners who'd never once set foot on it. "Nobody's touched those trees since before I had children," Chalmers told her, sitting on her porch that week, clearly delighted at the chance to talk about a piece of land he'd assumed had long since disappeared under the vine for good. Didn't figure there was anything left of them to find. What the goats found, over the following 2 months as Odessa deliberately routed their rotating paddocks to follow the old orchard rows she and Desmond had started mapping, was more than Chalmers or Odessa herself had expected. Nearly 60 individual trees, the vast majority of them dead or too far gone to save, but a genuine surprise scattered among them. 11 trees, mostly along the southern edge where the ground drained better, and the kudzu canopy had apparently been thinner, that had survived 2 decades of neglect and vine smothering well enough to still be alive underneath it all, gnarled and stunted but budding out, once the goats stripped the choking vine away and let real sunlight reach them again for the first time in a generation. "You didn't buy kudzu," Walter Lee admitted that fall, standing beside Odessa in what had been, 6 months earlier, an unbroken green mound, indistinguishable from every other unbroken green mound on the property. "You bought an orchard that happened to be wearing a very good disguise." "I bought 45 acres for $3, Odessa said. "The orchard was always going to be whatever was actually underneath. I just needed something patient enough and hungry enough to go looking without tearing up whatever it found along the way." Odessa spent the following 2 years nursing those 11 surviving trees back into real production, alongside a new planting of young trees to replace the ones too far gone to save, and kept the goats working in careful, monitored rotation through the rest of the property, both to hold the kudzu back permanently and to keep uncovering whatever else the old orchard's original owners might have left behind, which turned out, eventually, to include a second, smaller planting of pecan trees near the property's eastern boundary that nobody, including Chalmers, had remembered was ever there at all. By her third harvest, Odessa was selling apples and a modest crop of pecans at the same county farmers market where Walter Lee sold his own beef, and the story of the $3 kudzu farm had traveled far enough around the county that a small trickle of visitors started showing up specifically to see it, curious in the particular way people get about land that seems to have gotten something back that everyone assumed was gone for good. "People still laugh about the $3, Odessa said, standing in an orchard row thick with fruit that had spent 20 years no one believed still existed. I let them. $3 was never really the price of the land. It was just the price of finding out what was still under it."